We just got another excellent episode of House of the Dragon. A lot of stuff happened. We got a fire at Harrenhal. We got Rhaenyra leaving the court at King's Landing and going to Dragonstone. We got Otto probably coming back as Hand for next episode. We got Larys taking action. We got a lot of different moving parts. But one of the most interesting portions is the introduction of all of these new child characters who are all new to the series and who have great implications for the story to come. Particularly, one line from one of them really threw me for a loop and could have great implications for the story to come. So I wanted to break that down and talk about each of these children characters well, for those who might be unfamiliar. And yeah, if you enjoy this, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, let me know who your favorite of these new characters is so far. In this episode, we met 6 new children characters. There was Jacaerys, Lucerys, and Joffrey, the children of Rhaenyra. They are Valerions, born to Laenor and Rhaenyra. They're the younger of the batches of kids, as they did not start happening until post-time skip, whereas a couple of Alicent's kids have been born prior to the time skip, as we saw in episode 3 and in episode 4. The other children that I wanted to talk about, the ones that mainly center this video, are Alicent's children. Aegon, who is the eldest son, Aemond, who is the second son and third born, and Helaena, who is the subject of this video. Helaena is an interesting character who has a lot of different elements to her, and there's one line in particular here that really made me curious as to what magical gifts she might possess. This section will contain brief spoilers for the next episode of House of the Dragon, so if you haven't read the book, be sure to skip ahead. I'll leave a timestamp in the description as to when you can skip to. But the one conversation we see with Helaena and her mother this episode reveals quite a bit about a potential ability that Helaena may possess. She's talking with her mom about her bug collection, and then her brother Aemond comes in to discuss his unsuccessful attempt to claim Dreamfire in the Dragon Pit. Helaena is just kind of talking to herself, throwing out the odd line throughout this conversation. But at some point in this conversation, when Alicent talks about what it would take for Aemond to claim a dragon, Helaena says, "You'll have to close an eye," which is quite interesting, given the fact that Aemond does lose an eye to claim his dragon Vhagar. She exactly predicts this correctly. We've seen Targaryens predict the future before. Viserys has even done it. These are called dragon dreams. It is claimed that Aegon the Conqueror had them, as did the Targaryen that left Valyria in the first place in order to found their house on Dragonstone. This is a very important ability for the Targaryen house, and as far as we know, she's the only Targaryen in the present, other than Viserys, who has this ability. I think that could make Helaena quite valuable, particularly in any coming conflict, as someone who could be at least thought of as clairvoyant, should this realization come to the other characters, that yes, she can see the future to some degree, be it correct or incorrect, though in this case it was correct. That could be quite interesting, and it could play into a lot of what Helaena does in the future, and could make her a far more interesting character as well, as she is a very tragic character, and that knowledge of the future could lead to even further tragedy for her. I just thought that was a really interesting touch, and I love that the writers threw that in there. I think it's quite interesting, and it makes sense that at least one of Viserys' kids would have dragon dreams, given the fact that he himself did. It would really be a shame if none of them had that ability, and given the fact that he's had 5 children at this point, including Daeron, who we've not seen, he's being fostered in Old Town, it makes sense that at least one of the 5 would have this old Targaryen ability. It is worth noting that these dragon dreams might not be entirely helpful. One example of a character with dragon dreams we see in the books, in The Hedge Knight, is known as Daeron the Drunken, essentially. He is a Targaryen prince from about 100 years before the main series, and he essentially turns to alcoholism simply because his dreams are essentially driving him crazy. They just don't let up, and generally are a very stressful experience for him. And I think that overall that could end up being the way that it is played with Rhaella as well, as she is a character that does end up with some unhappy situations in the book. I also thought it was quite a bit interesting to see the other kids fleshed out more. Aemond was a lot more humanized than I expected him to be. He seems to really have a plight about him, and the fact that he hasn't claimed dragons when all of his other kids around him have seems like a pretty compelling arc for him, at least in the fact that you can very much see why he might feel inferior at a point and why the others might look down to him. And that could really make some of his actions later on in the series a lot more understandable. Furthermore, the way they've characterized Aegon is also quite interesting. He seems very reluctant about most things that don't involve girls. And overall, he seems to be a fairly interesting character. I've seen him compared to Joffrey a fair bit in the discussion since the episode has occurred, but I don't necessarily get that. He seems pretty stable, if a bit arrogant, which I would assume comes with the territory of just being a prince. But yeah, overall, I think that the three of them are very interesting characters, and I really like all of Alicent's kids, and they seem to be adding a lot more dimension and depth to each of them, similarly to how they did with Alicent throughout the series. I look forward to the same depth being added to Rhaenyra's kids eventually, albeit they're a bit young at the moment, and it would be difficult to add that kind of dimension to them at this stage. But I'm sure that we'll get that as time jumps continue on further into the future. Speaking of Rhaenyra's kids, I do quite like that Jace is portrayed as knowing that Harwin was his father, as that does add a very interesting element to his character. Having that knowledge that he is a bastard that young could do something to kind of his desire to prove himself, or his desire to be a true Targaryen. I think that'll be really nice to see with the character moving forward, and I think it's a great development from the books. In this episode, they've done a ton to humanize characters from the books that didn't really get a ton of characterization on the page, and that's one of my favorite things this series has done so far, and I really, really appreciate it. But yeah, that was the video about Rhaella and her potential dragon dreams. What do you think of all of this? Do you think that that could be something that the story uses in the future, or could be a potentially interesting element of her character? How do you think this might play in the future? Be sure to leave a comment, let me know. I'd love to hear about it. And yeah, while you're down there, leave a like, subscribe if you enjoyed. I'd really appreciate it. And yeah, thank you all for watching.